I mentioned at the beginning of the show, and it's something that I've read in your sort of papers, and it really impressed me. You're talking, and many other people, many scientists are talking about an epidemic crisis, the Armageddon of biological Armageddon that is coming. Now, this is horrendous. I mean, it's a tremendous statement to be made. Can you explain that and why you feel such an epidemic is coming?
Well, what I've seen in the research that I did, instead of going forward and trying to research the stuff that conventional medicine has done that suppresses the causes of disease and basically fights against the symptoms of the body trying to heal itself, I went back and looked into the past to see what people did when all they had were natural healing methods. And there was a scientist named Georges Lakovsky, who was a Russian scientist that moved to France to study cancer. In certain areas of France, it was geographical. And he wondered, why was there so much disease in these certain areas where people lived? And he studied everything. He studied their lifestyles. He studied their diets. He studied their heredity. And he came to the conclusion that in the areas where they lived, there were certain types of soil that when incoming radiation from the sun, the stars, and the planets would hit the Earth, it would not be absorbed into the Earth, but it would bounce off and create an interference field that was very powerful, that the people living in those fields, it would disrupt how the energy within their cells actually worked. The new paradigm for microbes and the war of radiations within our cells is that our cells are like little computers. You have software inside the cells, which is the RNA and the DNA. The RNA tells the cell how to function. The DNA tells the cell how to become a new cell. And then you have small amounts of radiation, the same amount of radiation that the cell uses to survive. It disrupts that software and consequently creates a catastrophic effect in the cells. And when you have this amount of solar radiation reaching epidemic proportions as it has throughout history, the solar radiation comes from sunspots, which are massive volcanic explosions on the face of the sun that are thousands of times bigger than the Earth itself. And it sends in X-ray radiation, ultraviolet radiation. When it hits the Earth, people living in these areas where you have this clay-like soil that reflects the radiation, it disrupts how their cells work. There was another scientist, a Russian scientist, Dr. Chehevsky, and he studied solar radiation. He studied sunspot cycles that go on 11-year cycles. And as he went back and looked throughout history, he saw that major events in human history occurred at the times when the sun was at its maximum. It would be turmoils and crisis within societies. It would be major plagues.
It's very interesting you say this, because actually this was the question I was going to ask you, the fact that mentioning the solar influence and the fact that every time we have a solar maximus, is that the way you call it? I saw some graphics that you showed me, and every time this solar maximus at its peak, there is a crisis, and I noticed that in 1979, which was the introduction of AIDS, we had such a peak. So there is a relation, you feel, of this electromagnetic field and this solar sort of bombardment of rays. There is a direct relationship to all these things that are happening?
Well, you go back and look at one of the greatest plagues to hit humanity, and it was the Spanish flu around 1916, 1917, and 1918. There's projected over 345 million people that died, and people that live at that time, they still remember the circumstances of how devastating it was on whole communities as people died unprotected from this type of virus. And you go and look in periods of 11.5 years at the solar maximum in human history, and you see outbreaks of major plagues worldwide. They went back and looked at the blood supplies, because every year they would take samples of the blood supplies, and then they went back and looked at the blood supply for 1978, 1977, 1976, 1975, and they saw the beginnings of the AIDS virus in those blood. But in 1978, 1979, 80, the solar radiation almost went completely off the scale. In a minimum time of solar radiation, you have maybe 5 to 6 solar flares or solar eruptions during those times. But in the times of maximum solar radiation, you can have anywhere between 175 to 200 to 210 solar eruptions per month, which is just an incredible amount of radiation hitting the Earth, because you have ultraviolet radiation and X-ray radiation that everybody knows can cause skin cancer, that can disrupt how the cells work by actually breaking the chromosomes.
And obviously the danger is even more bigger now because of the ozone problem and so on. But let me come back to the things that you've said, because a lot of people watching us, I'm sure they're very skeptical about how direct influence this solar maximus or maximum, is it maximum?
Maximum, yeah.
Maximum, okay. How this solar maximum has, whether it's really that serious or whether it's just a theory by some people such as yourself or some scientists and so on. Is this documented? Are there any sort of statistics, any knowledge beyond a theory that would really sort of put this thing together and can really force us to look into this very, very seriously and accept that, yes, electromagnetic fields and this solar maximum can really create problems?
Well, Dr. Chehevsky was one of the pioneers in this field. He was recognized as the one that actually saw the correlations between disease and the periodicity of the solar radiation. And he went back and looked at human history for over 2,000 years and charted it in 11.1 year segments, which is the solar cycle, and saw direct correlations of plagues of like typhus, smallpox, things along those lines. And there's a recent book that just came out 2 years ago. I went back and looked at his work and charted it all the way back to 2,000 years before that in 11-year segments to look at human history to see of catastrophic events like plagues that had a major impact in history at that time. I went all the way back to, strange enough, the Peloponnesian War, where you have Athens and I guess it was the Trojans, where they were battling, and there was a plague that occurred right at that time. And if you go back and read the works of Thucydides, which is a historian at that time, it had almost exactly the same symptoms as the people that are experiencing the Ebola virus in certain areas of Africa, where entire towns are being wiped out. In the book, The Coming Plagues by Laurie Gettert, who's a research writer, she goes through and pinpoints all the plagues that we've had in history from the 1900s onward. And when I did that, it was almost the hair raised on the back of my neck when I saw the correlations. And there's something happening with the solar radiation, is that historically it would only rise for maybe 1 year in that period of 11 years, but over the last 3 cycles the solar radiation has maintained an intense level for 3 years at a time.
Which is very, very scary, and scary, of course, is the fact that if we are to accept the immediate relationship of radiation, of solar radiation, and its relation to these plagues and these diseases and these epidemics, of course, the next question that follows is besides the natural sort of bombardment of solar radiation, we have the humanly created radiation. We have our television sets, we have our radio sets, we have our mobile telephones. Are we to be sort of concerned about this? Is there a direct relationship between these apparatus and this?
Well,